to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and today we are going to talk about the different theories which scholars have put forward to explain what type of state existed in the Indus Valley Civilization. So in this video, we will first discuss the debate, and we will also see that whether there was any ruling class in Indus Valley Civilization or not. So these are the two important questions which we will discuss. Now, when we are talking about the debate about the different models of state that has been put forward by many scholars, we have to understand that there are two important theoretical questions which these scholars answer in very different way. To explain whether there was any state or ruling class in Indus Valley Civilization. So these two important questions are: first, that if there is a society which is complex, so a complex society would be a society which has cities, which has sophisticated technologies like drainage, and making of tools. So these complex technologies, sophisticated technologies, and it also has large scale residential architecture, and it also takes part in large long distance trade. So these qualities which is present in a particular society. So if these qualities are present in a particular society, this society would be called a complex society. So the first question is whether a complex society can be classified as a state. Now you may ask, what do you mean by state here? So a state basically means a society or a organization that has a ruling class or political hierarchy. So the first theoretical question is whether we can call whether if there is a society which is complex, can we say that now this complex society also has to have a state? The second theoretical question is whether the emergence of cities also leads to the emergence of ruling class. So these are the two theoretical questions which we will see that different scholars who have studied or who have proposed different models for the state in Indus Valley Civilization, how they answer it differently. So what we find is that the early scholars who discovered this civilization, we all know that in 1920s cities of this civilization were discovered. So those scholars who were the first to study this civilization, for them the answer to these questions were quite straightforward. Firstly, when we talk about the first question, whether complex societies also has to have state or not, so for these early scholars, I will call these early scholars traditional scholars or traditional view. So according to the traditional view, if there is a complex society, then there must be a state. So this was the basic understanding of the traditional scholars or traditional view. When it comes to the second question, they were of the view that if cities are emerging in a particular civilization, then it must mean that there is also the presence of ruling class. So these two theoretical questions were answered in this way by the early scholars. So that is why what we find is that when it comes to explaining what kind of state existed in Indus Valley Civilization, these scholars have firstly, now I think you can guess what kind of answers which these scholars have given. So Indus Valley Civilization had cities, it has sophisticated technologies like drainage, and there were also tools and art crafts which were of high quality. Then there were large scale residential architecture, and we also find that there were long distance trade. So these elements of complex society were present in Indus Valley civilization. So as the traditional view says that if there is a complex society, then it must have then a state should also exist. So this is what was also argued by these traditional scholars. And we also see that Indus Valley civilization had cities, so that means there was also a ruling class that ruled these cities. And and the models which they put forward was quite I think most of us have also heard about these, because these being older theories are quite popular. So I think most of us have heard about the priest king, that in ancient civilization there was this priest king, and we have also seen the sculpture which was found from Mohenjo-daro. So this was the scholar who had put forward this theory was Mortimer Wheeler. And Mortimer Wheeler argued that there was this priest king whose sculpture was discovered from Mohenjo-daro, who on the one hand enjoyed the secular powers and also religious powers. That is why he was also a priest and a king. And this was the idea that was borrowed from Mesopotamia, but he used this idea in the Indus case as well. And when we come to if we look at the traditional scholars, basically what we find is that they believed that in Indus Valley civilization, the government was centralized, whose power was rooted firmly in agricultural production and surplus and its redistribution. And to explain that, they also provided the evidence, or they speculated. So one question which one can ask is, how can we say that in Indus cities there was this agricultural production and also redistribution of agriculture? So to explain this this speculation, they provided evidence that comes from Harappa. I think most of us who have some basic knowledge of Indus Valley civilization knew about a public structure called granaries, or these inverted commas, because what we see is that when these scholars have proposed that a particular structure in Harappa should be viewed as granaries, they had this theory in mind that in Harappan civilization had a centralized government, and the ruling class had the policy of redistribution, and the agricultural production was controlled by the state. So in order to justify this theory, they had named a particular public structure from Harappa granaries. But when we look at the evidence, we do not have any evidence to say that this was actually a granary or not, because we have not found a single seed of wheat or rice or barley, anything. So there is literally no evidence to say whether this was a granary in 4,000 years ago or not. So according to the traditional scholars, this Harappan state was a centralized state, and they also argued that this state had two cities, twin capital cities. First was Harappa and second was Mohenjo-daro. So now you can say, now one can ask what kind of evidence which these scholars have put forward to justify these theories. So firstly, they argues that these theories are they put a great emphasis on the homogeneity of material culture. By material culture, I mean pottery and the different kind of building structures, writing, etc. So these scholars argue that if you look at the layout of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, you will find that there are quite a few similarities. Then they point out that if you look at the system of weight and measures, you will see that they are identical in this vast area that covered the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. The pottery style is also same in most of these Harappan or Indus Valley sites. And the different decorations and other ornamental materials which we have found, like seals, ceilings, etc., we also find that there is great similarity between different sites. So considering this, they argue that if we all know that Indus Valley civilization were located in a highly diverse environmental condition. So on the one hand, we have a site like Alamgirpur, which is in western UP. Then we have a site from Afghanistan, Shortugai. So, or you can say that sites like Dholavira and Harappa. So these sites are located in different environmental conditions. But what we find is that the material culture in these sites are same. The pottery is same. The layout of these cities is more or less the same. And the seals and ceilings which are found are also more or less the same. So all of these evidence suggest that in Indus Valley civilization, there was a centralized state and the ruler this large civilization was controlled by a single state, and it had two twin capitals. So this is basically some scholars have called this whole model as the imperial framework model. And what you will find here is that if you look at how they have explained, these scholars have explained other civilization like Mesopotamia and Egypt. So this imperial framework model was earlier applied in Mesopotamian civilization to explain Mesopotamian civilization or Indus Valley civilization, not Indus Valley civilization, Egyptian civilization. But these early scholars who first studied Indus Valley civilization, what they did was they adopted the model which they had used for Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt and applied it on Indus Valley civilization. So this was the whole argument of early scholars of the traditional view or of the imperial framework. So now what we see is that later when we find that more excavations were carried out in different Indus sites, and there were new scholars who tested new approaches to explain different aspects of Indus Valley civilization. They provided some very different explanations compared to the early view. So I think so we know that I have explained that for the traditional or imperial framework, if there is a complex society, then the state must have emerged in this society. But the new interpretations or scholars who put forward a different interpretations, they argued that if a society is complex, then it does not mean that this society must also have a state. So this was the first radically different understanding of how these new scholars understood complex societies and the emergence of state. Then they also argued that the emergence of cities does not mean the emergence of ruling class. So you can see that there is this completely opposite understanding of complex society, emergence of state, emergence of cities, and presence of ruling class in these new interpretations. So now here, when these scholars gave different models to explain Indus Valley civilization, we see that there is a spectrum. So on the one hand, we have scholars like Walter Fairservice, who argued that the Indus Valley Civilization was a stateless society. There was no state. It was a amalgamation of chiefdoms, and there was no political centralization or hierarchy. So this was the view of Walter Fairservice. So he is on the extreme side of this spectrum. So on the one hand, we have scholars who believe that the Indus state or the Indus Valley Civilization was centralized. So they are on the other end of the spectrum, and Walter Fairservice is on the other end of the spectrum and argues that the Indus Valley Civilization had no state. Then there are scholars who are somewhere in the middle. For example, if we look at the work of Mark Kenoyer, so Mark Kenoyer argues that Harappan civilization was not a stateless society. It was a state level society which had no single ruler, and he believes that there were different city states, and in these city states there were different communities that competed for control. The presence of ruling class or ruling elite and was explained by using a concept called heterarchy. I will explain this concept of heterarchy later, but what he argued that there were different ruling elites which constantly struggled with each other for supremacy, and there were also times when there was no ruling elite present. So, and this ruling elites of the Indus Valley Civilization were comprised of merchants, landowners, and ritual specialists. So to explain the dynamic relations which existed between different ruling elites of Indus Valley Civilization, Kenoyer and other scholars have proposed the concept of heterarchy. Now, what does heterarchy mean, you might ask? So to understand what is heterarchy, we have to first have a clear definition of what hierarchy means. So hierarchy is basically so a hierarchical organization or a hierarchical setup would be a setup in which elements are ranked and where a particular group of individuals is subordinate to other groups. So to explain, basically what we find is that let's take the example of army. Army is a ranked organization. By ranked, we all understand that at the bottom there is a private soldier, and then when we move and if we move upwards, we have major, colonel, etc. So there is this rank that is present in a particular in army, in the army, and there is also a clear decision making chain. So if a major orders, then this chain of command flows downwards, and there is officially a soldier cannot order a major, or a major cannot order a colonel or a general. So this is the chain of command which we see in an army. So basically this is a hierarchical structure, which is so basically any structure which is ranked and there is a clear decision making chain, then this particular and then any organization would be called hierarchical, and it should also have levels which are subordinate or which are above a particular level. So we know that soldiers are below majors and majors are below colonels. So this is the definition of what a hierarchy is. Now coming to heterarchy, here what we find is that there is no ranking, no step or stages. And if there is a rank, then this ranking changes with circumstance. So basically, ranking would mean that, so to explain, let's take an example of an army where what we find is that depending upon the circumstance, a soldier could be at the top and major, colonel, generals would be at the bottom. Then in a different situation, we will see that the major is now on the top and soldiers, colonels and generals are at the bottom or below the major. So in hierarchical setups or in hierarchical organizations, the status of a particular individual or a group changes with circumstances. To better understand this, let's take the example of 4 cities. We have cities like Delhi, Leh and Somnath. So if you compare in terms of population, there is a clear hierarchy. Delhi is on the top, then there is Somnath, and then there is Leh. But when we compare, let's say, when we compare to the strategic location or the defense value, here depending upon the situation, the importance of Leh or Delhi changes. So this is the broader concept of hierarchy. So scholars like Mark Kenoyer had used this theory of hierarchy to explain this whole state in Indus Valley Civilization. But I must say that this concept of hierarchy was not, it is not accepted by other scholars, and they argue that if we are talking about hierarchical groups or the concept of hierarchy in general, what we find is that we cannot explain how this hierarchical system impacted the social organization of the Indus Valley Civilization, or what was the wealth distribution in this whole hierarchical setup. Then what we also find is that we cannot explain whether how deep this hierarchical setup was in the Indus Valley Civilization. Because if we look at the concept of hierarchy in general, we find that hierarchy can be found in extremely unequal society. So if you look at the imperial elites in different parts of the Roman Empire, they were in a hierarchical organization, or they were interacting with each other hierarchically. There was no hierarchy in the imperial elites of Roman Empire. The power and the rank of a particular group of elite changed with circumstances. So what we find is that in the case of Roman Empire, there is this hierarchy which is present, but we also know that the Roman Empire was deeply hierarchical. So basically the arguments of those scholars who criticize this concept of hierarchy, they argue that through this concept of hierarchy, we cannot explain whether the Indus Valley Civilization was deeply hierarchical or not, and we cannot also explain whether how much hierarchy was present in Indus Civilization, to put it in simple terms. So this is the view of some scholars like Mark Kenoyer, who uses this I will say that confusing concept of hierarchy. Then there is then we have other scholars like Dilip Chakrabarti. Dilip Chakrabarti argues that the Indus Valley Civilization had multiple kingdoms which were centered around major settlements of a region, and each distributive zones and it could also be the case that in one particular environmental zone there could be more than one kingdom. So basically Dilip Chakrabarti is completely rejecting the idea that there was a single centralized state that existed in the Indus Valley Civilization. Then we have the view of Rita Wright, who has written a book called Ancient Indus, Urbanism, Economy and Society. And in this book, Rita Wright discusses two models to explain the Indus Valley Civilization, and both of these models are not very different from each other, and we can say that both of these two models support each other. So the first model is the central place model, or the central place theory, and the second is the concept of a city state. So what do we mean by central place theory or central place model? So a central place, so this model basically means that there is a city or a central place which is existing within a peripheral or secondary center. In other words, suppose there is a single large primary center, which is a city. And this single large primary center is situated in the center of multiple secondary centers or towns. And then there are also smaller peripheral settlements or villages. So basically there is a city, and this city is surrounded by towns and villages. And in towns, we see that production and distribution happens. So to explain in context of Indus Valley Civilization, Rita Wright argues that if you look at the city of Harappa, the city of Harappa served as the focal point of outlying production areas. By outlying production area, basically the towns and villages where production happened, and the area was basically the Bayas settlements. So the Indus settlements in the Bayas region were producing products, and the city of Harappa acted as the focal point of these productions. And what we also find is that if you look at the second model, which is the city-state model, the city-state model basically complements the central place model. So now I think when we think of the city-state, this idea of ancient Greek city-state comes to our mind, and which is quite obvious because this city-state model was originally defined keeping in mind the Greek polis. But later what we find is that with the discovery of new civilizations, with extensive study of other civilization, we find that this city-state model was broadened to include cities of Mesopotamia, Maya, and even the cities of the Mahajanpat period in northern Indian subcontinent. So how these cities of the Mahajanpat period functioned is explained by this city-state model. And in this city-state model, basically the city became the link that connected smaller towns and villages to the outside regions. The villages and the towns, basically in the towns, we see the production happening. Raw material was provided from the villages, and the production was then, collected. The different production centers sent their items to the city, and from the city these items were then traded to different outside regions. So this was the role of the city in this whole model. And here in this model, the city or the city state is politically independent, but culturally it is unified with other city states. So if you look at in this model, if you want to explain the Indus Valley Civilization using this model, you would argue that if you are talking about, let's say, the city of Harappa and the city of Rakhigadi, These were different city-states, but the material culture of these two different city-states were basically the same. That is why we have the same pottery or the same seals and ceilings which are used in both of these different city-states. And we also find that other material cultures like writing system, etc., are both the same in these two city-states. And you would also notice you will also notice here is that in this particular model, the city-state model and the complex palace model, here what we find is that there is this emphasis on the political and commercial nature of the city, which is very important, because one of the main explanation of Indus Valley Civilization was that there is great trade that happened in this civilization. So this city-state model, or the central place model, was one of the various models which scholars have put forward to explain the presence of state, or whether there was any state in Indus Valley Civilization or not. So this is the explanation of Rita Wright. Then if you look at the work of Upinder Singh, she provides us a very different approach. She argues that it is also possible that there were several states that had different kind of political organization within this huge area. We all know that if we compare the area of the Indus Valley Civilization, it dwarfs the area of Mesopotamian civilization, or the Egyptian civilization, or even the Chinese civilization. So in this vast area, Upinder Singh argues that it is very hard for us to believe that there was a single political system that existed. So she believes that there could be multiple different political structures or political organizations that existed in these different parts of this broader civilization. Now what we also find is that there is also this great debate about the ruling class. So let's discuss this debate also. And there are scholars who argue that if you look at the buildings of IVC, you will find that not all buildings are the same. So they basically conclude that this clearly shows that in Indus Valley Civilization, there was a presence of ruling class or ruling elite. But if you analyze this point, you will find that it is true that not all the buildings are equal, but the site itself are quite different. So basically, if you look at let's say 5 Indus sites, we have 5 cities, basically Harappa, Rakhigadi, Mohenjo-daro, Ganveriwala and Dholavira. These are basically the 5 cities which has the kind of structure and the area which is quite significant in these 5 cities. Then we have hundreds of Indus sites that are smaller than 30 hectare. So you can see that within the broader Indus Valley Civilization, you have these 2 different classifications of cities. Basically, on the one hand, we have these 5 cities, and then we have hundreds of sites that are smaller than 30 hectare. Now, if you look at the cities, you will find that there is something quite interesting. Mark Kenoyer has divided the Harappa, or has divided, basically he argues that there are 3 types of architecture which is present in Harappan cities. For example, he argues that on the one hand, we have private rooms, which are basically the 2-story rooms, and if you compare the thickness of the wall in some structures, one can argue that there were also some 3-story structures. But generally we find that these private rooms were 2-story structures. The 3-story structures are rarer. And then the rooms of these private these private houses were arranged around a central courtyard. Another interesting thing that we see in these private houses is that the view of the house from outside or from the street is blocked by a wall. So this is a private house which has smaller rooms, and these are two-story buildings. Then we have large houses. Large houses are houses that are surrounded by these smaller houses, and what we also find is that there are scholars who have argued that these smaller houses that surround this large house were basically the place of where relatives or those who provided services to the residents of this large house lived. And then on the third category which we find in Indus cities is large public structures. For example, we have all heard the famous Great Bath or the granary, which is actually not a granary, but it is a public structure nonetheless. So what defines a large public structure? Basically, a large public structure is a structure which can be accessed from different routes, or one can go from the one end to the other end of this public structure through a thoroughfare. So this is so these are the three different types of architecture which we see in Harappan cities. So by pointing out the difference in the type of architecture, some scholars have argued that this shows there was a ruling elite in Harappan valleys, in the Indus Valley Civilization. And if you look at the work of Rita, Wright, she provides us a very interesting point. She argues that the drainage system, if you analyze the drainage system of different Harappan cities, you will find that there are these soak pits where the waste was collected from the drainage. And from time to time, someone had to clean this waste from the soak pits. So I think you have guessed where I'm going with this idea. So Rita Wright argues that the fact that from these soak pits one has to clean the waste, this means that there was a group, a special group that had to do this work. And most likely those people who did this work were from the bottom of the social hierarchy. Then she also argues that if you look at the houses, particularly the smaller houses, you will find that some of these houses are few feet from the soak pits, particularly their entrance. And if suppose you are living in this house, when you enter or exit from your house, you will get a terrible smell of the waste that was collecting in the soak pits. So basically, she is arguing that those who worked or who cleaned these soak pits and those who lived around these soak pits were most likely the people from the lower section of the Harappan society. So we can see that if we look at the layout of the city itself, one can see there was a social hierarchy. And compare this to the large houses, we find that there is no such foul smell that comes while entering, or because there is no soak pits nearby. So this is the argument which is presented by Rita Wright. I personally find this argument quite interesting. But there are criticisms of this model, because scholars have argued that if you look at public buildings, they were certainly not palaces, which is quite clear. We know that there were large houses and there were also smaller houses, and then there were public houses. But till up to this day or up to this time, we have not found a single structure which we can call palace or royal palace or priestly palace or anything. So this suggests that, or even the religious characters of public structures is a matter of debate. I think most of us have heard that we know that there is a Great Bath, but whether Great Bath had a religious significance is not known. So basically, the argument is, we know that in Harappan civilization or in Harappan cities there were public structures, but we cannot but there is no proof to suggest that these public structures were used by ruling elites. So this is the first point. Then what we also see is that if you look at if you compare the smaller houses with larger houses, you will find that the difference is not very significant. For example, the smallest model which we have found is 97 square meter, and large models are generally their average is 183 meters square meter. So what we are finding here basically is that the smallest house and the average large house is basically the difference is half, which is not a very big difference. And there is this scholar called Adam Green who has this interesting article called Killing the Priest King. And in this article, he has, given this beautiful argument which goes like this. He argues that these large houses are mentioned at best, but not palaces that were occupied by ruling elites of other society. So basically, if suppose, let's say, if you want to compare in Mughal cities, can we say that the size of the palace in which the Mughal emperor lived was only twice as large as the smallest house that was found in this particular capital of the Mughal Empire? This is not the case. We will find that the Mughal emperor lived in a very large structure, which was significantly larger than the smallest house in a particular city. Whereas in the Harappan case, this is not the case. And there's this beautiful line which Adam Green has in this article, Killing the Priest King, which is, access to few more rooms does not make you a priest king. So like we have seen that the smallest model is 97 square meter and the average size of larger house is 183 meter square. So that does not mean that if you are living in this 183 meter square house, you are a priest king, because the difference is not very significant. So this is the basic, criticism of the different structure model. And even the arguments of Rita Wright has been questioned. Like I have discussed that according to Rita Wright, we can find if you analyze the layout of the city or the drainage system, you can say that there was a particular social group which lived in a lower hierarchical position. But according to other scholars who have criticized Rita Wright's argument, they point out that the management of waste does not necessarily have to be done by a social group. One can certainly argue that there were individuals who did this particular work, and this work was not hereditary. It was not like a particular person who is cleaning these soak pits, and the son of this person will also have to clean this soak pit. We do not have evidence about this type of practice. So there was no hereditary practices like these that were present in Indus Valley Civilization. Secondly, the point is that the relative distance from the drainage system is not a very great argument for the presence of social hierarchy, because we do not, as we have just seen from Adam Grant's argument, that the difference of large house and small house is not very big. So one cannot one cannot argue that there was a ruling elite by just measuring the distance from the drainage system. So this argument in itself is quite weak. So this is the broader point. Basically what we see is that if you want to summarize these whole arguments, on the one hand, what we find is that in Harappan cities, we do not have any palaces. We have not found any palaces, and we have also not found religious structures, which we can clearly say that this was a religious structures. Of course, scholars say that Great Bath was a religious structure, but there is no evidence at present to say that this was definitely a religious structure. So this suggests, we do not have any palaces as well. So basically these all point to the direction that the ruling class in Harappan cities was absent. So this is a quite interesting conclusion. But I must say that because we are dealing with Indus Valley Civilization, a civilization whose writing we cannot read, we cannot say for sure whether this type of social hierarchy, we cannot say that there was no social hierarchy or there was no ruling elite that was present in Indus Valley Civilization. But it is quite interesting. But one thing which we can say is that the evidence which we have found up until now suggest that there was no ruling class. Now, in future, if we find some royal tomb or a royal palace, then this particular view will certainly change. But at this point, I particularly believe that the evidence points to a egalitarian society or to a somewhat egalitarian society. When we talk about the models, for example, the different state models, which I think I have also, explained different state models. I particularly find the argument of Dilip Chakrabarti quite interesting, because Dilip Chakrabarti also points out that in Indian history, the similarity in material culture does not mean the similarity in political setup. So what does that basically means? So I think in the first part of this podcast, I have explained that according to the traditional view or the imperial view, the Indus Valley Civilization was a centralized entity because the material culture of this civilization was the same. We have similar seals, we have similar pottery, and we have similar building structures. So all of these material cultures, the fact that these material cultures are same when we compare to sites from Western UP to sites in Eastern Punjab or Pakistani Punjab. So the fact that we have same material culture means that the Harappan, the Indus Valley Civilization was a centralized state. But as Dilip Chakrabarti points out, that in Indian history, the similarity in material culture does not mean that there is a single political entity that is ruling. So he gives a great example from the Mahajanpad period. Now we all know that in Mahajanpad period there were two different types of political structure that we find. On the one hand, we had monarchies, and then there were ganas or sanghas, which were oligarchy, or we can call it, or some. I personally don't find this term quite appealing, but republics. So we have two different political structures in the different states of the Mahajanpat period. But if you look at the material evidence, for example, you will find that from, let's say, Champa, which is on the border of Bihar and Bengal, we find that we have northern black polished ware, NBPW. And if you go to Takshashila, you will also find that here also there is this northern black polished ware. Or if you let's say go to Vaishali, you will also have this northern black polished ware. Now, if we do not have any written records from the Mahajanpat period, then we can most likely say that in the Mahajanpat period, since the material culture was same, because we are finding pottery from we are finding the same pottery from different regions. So because we are finding same pottery, this means that there was a single political entity that was ruling this vast domain. But because we have written records or literary records, we can say that this was not the case. There were different political kingdoms which had different political structures that ruled in different parts of northern India. So he has applied this argument to the Harappan case. Basically the argument goes like this: because we have material culture which is similar, that does not mean that in Indus Valley Civilization there was a single political structure. So this argument of Dilip Chakrabarti I find quite appealing, and also Upinder Singh's approach, where she argues that in Indus Valley Civilization it could be the case that there were different types of political structures that existed in this vast civilization. So these two approaches when deal with the state models of Indus Valley Civilization are, in my view, they are quite right. So this is the basic overview of the different models which scholars have put forward to explain the state in Indus Valley Civilization, and I have also dealt with the question of whether there was a ruling elite in Indus Valley Civilization or not.